Today we are wrapping up chapter 2 of Ruth. And if you remember where we left off in verse 19 of our last devotion, Boaz and Ruth are having a beautiful conversation. Ruth goes back with more grain than she can even hold, like a 50-pound dog food bag of grain. And then she goes home to Naomi, and Naomi is astonished at what she is holding. She's like, "Where have you been? Obviously, the Lord has blessed wherever you have been." And this is a big thing because all of a sudden we're going to focus on this devotion today, not on Ruth, but at the heart of Naomi. What is changing in Naomi in these moments? And so for so many of us, we could be like, yeah, when I let God have it and when I'm just bitter at God, he doesn't care about me anymore. I've been bitter with him. But we're going to see a different storyline happening here. God is not done with Naomi, just as God is not done with us when we choose to be bitter or angry. He is still pursuing us. We just have to turn our eyes to the pursuer. And that's exactly what's happening in the heart of Naomi here. When we start in verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness from the living and from the dead." Naomi's history of rebellion, she is seeing God smile upon her with all the food that is provided for her that she knows is not normal, but has to be a blessing from the Lord. And I love how we talk about names here, because remember when Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitter. Names have a meaning in the scriptures, and Boaz's name means standing in strength. She is seeing that Boaz standing up for her, and we're going to see the beautiful analogy of Boaz being God himself, kind of fighting for Naomi and Ruth. Naomi goes on to say, "That man is our relative. He is one of our redeemers," after Ruth says in the previous verse, "Oh, it was Boaz's field." And for you and I, we can be like, okay, he's a relative, he's a redeemer, but that held power in this world. And let me explain to you why. A kinsman redeemer, one of the redeemers, like when she would have said that, that would have put like a in Ruth's heart, because there was this Jewish law set in place by God himself. He told the Israelite nation to follow this rule, that the kinsman redeemer, it's a relative, had the ability, privilege, responsibility, however you want to look at it, that if a relative was in trouble, financial trouble, danger, anything like that, that they could redeem them and redeem the property. Usually this meant like a financial trouble. And so you could redeem the property of the relative, but it also meant you had to redeem the person. I'll explain that in more detail. Every 50 years, God set in place the year of Jubilee. And basically every 50 years, all properties purchased by corporations or wealthy individuals, because the person themselves was bankrupt or debt, they had to revert to the original owner. It was God's way of making sure that the wealthy didn't just get wealthier and the poor just get poorer. Every 50 years, if something was purchased because of a debt or a bankruptcy, it had to go back to the original owner. But who can wait 50 years? 50 years is like once in a person's lifetime, especially during this time when they probably only lived till about that. And so when we understand that this was old age to even be able to experience this, that why could you wait so long? So God also put in place this kinsman redeemer, and was where the closest kinsman had the right to buy back the property, which had been lost through bankruptcy. So they had the right to say, "Hey, I want to buy that back at the price that it was paid for," which was usually pretty cheap if somebody was in bankruptcy and just trying to get some money. They had the right to buy that back to redeem the person if they were the closest relative. The closest relative was the person who had the right. Now, it is referred in these verses that Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, probably before he left Judah, probably sold a lot of land because of debt and bankruptcy. Because we understand that there was a famine in the land and they were on hard times, which is why they chose to leave Judah for Moab. And so if we understand that, then she's saying, hey, Boaz is one of our kinsman redeemers. In other words, he can redeem the property that we sold for Elimelech. But if you redeem the property and there is a maiden of age who has lost her husband, you also have to redeem the maiden. That means you have to take her on as your wife. And it's going to get a little bit sketchy as we go through this story because there's some pieces in here that are going to be like, oh, this is soap opera, but just bear with me. So what she's saying is Boaz actually is the person that can redeem us. He can put us back where we have land and we're being taken care of. We fall under his protection. So verse 21. Then Ruth the Moabite said, "Furthermore, he said to me, you are to stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, so that others do not assault you in another field." Understanding, going back to this idea, it was dangerous for Ruth to be out here gleaning by herself, but she is still doing it. And basically, Ruth is saying, hey, he told me to just stay with his workers. And she's saying, no, stay with his servant girls and don't go to another field. And part of me looks at this and says, maybe this is Naomi even understanding what she had done in her own life. When she looked at, oh, there's blessings over in Moab. Oh, Moab has even more than what Judah has. They left for another field. And this is Naomi saying, hey, if God's blessings are sitting here, don't go and look for other blessings in other areas. Even though it's hard, even though you're still out there in the heat and the sun and you're just gleaning, don't go somewhere else where you think you could get more. Stay where you're at. And Naomi, probably speaking from experience, as she had left Judah, even when things were hard, for something that looked maybe a little more fruitful, but in the end ended up losing a lot of the blessings she had in life. Be in the Lord's faithful provision. And I think this is an interesting dynamic happening between Ruth and Naomi here. We're actually seeing the zeal of Ruth being like, he told me that I can be right with his servants. He told me, like, she has the zeal. But then we're seeing the wisdom of Naomi saying, hey, just be there. Don't go overzealous. Just continue doing your work. Don't, toot your own horn and say what you have. Just keep on being faithful and just stay right there. And I think this is an interesting dynamic because oftentimes young people have the zeal, but the old people have the wisdom. And when we see this partnership, it actually is a beautiful thing. So a little side note here on this devotion, if you are young, look for somebody with wisdom to invest in you. And if you have wisdom, look for somebody with zeal, because there is something that happens in both of those where Ruth gets Naomi moving forward, but Naomi makes sure Ruth moves forward in the right direction. So verse 23, so she stayed close by the young women of Boaz. So Ruth listened to Naomi in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This is how chapter 2 ends, and I want to pull out just a couple things in this verse 23 that can be easily overlooked. First of all, she gleaned until the end of the barley harvest. That is a 7-week period that she is just out in the sun gleaning. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because oftentimes when we could be like, hey, Boaz could redeem her. Boaz could put this whole thing behind them. He could rescue them. He could give them what they needed, so that way they could just be, stay-at-home women, just doing what women did, not out working, which women didn't typically do. But she didn't force the issue with Boaz. She just stayed faithful, and she just stayed working in that field for 7 weeks. And those were probably a long 7 weeks in the hot sun gleaning. And I think sometimes we have to learn something right here, that we have to be present and faithful even when we don't see God moving, or even when we see the way God could move and we would want to take matters into our own hands. We have to make sure that timing is right and wait on God's direction. So it's okay just to sit and be faithful, even when you see a lack of movement. But I also want us to understand the last line of this chapter, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Why is that important? Well, we look at the needs of Naomi. Naomi needed God, she needed food, and she needed family, and that's what God is providing for her. He is showing up for her. She is seeing him for the first time in a while. She is seeing the fact that God gave her more than enough food than what she needed through Ruth's gleaning. But she's also finding for the first time she is referring to Ruth as one of her family. This is my family. And so her needs are being met. But then we see Ruth's needs. Well, what is Ruth's needs? Well, she needs God and food and family, and God is providing. But there's one need still out there that God has not provided for Ruth yet. And that is, she is a young maiden who has yet to bear any children. She needs a husband. And that is still sitting out there unfulfilled. And that's why it says, and she just stayed living with her mother-in-law. There is still a need out there. Is God going to meet the need? Yes, in his perfect timing. And we have very interesting devotions to come as the whole thing is set up between Boaz and Ruth and what really goes on. But you're going to have to stay tuned for those. We hope you gleaned something out of today's devotion. You are so loved.